Okay. Mr. Cuban says, why is it so important to have kids if the world has an overpopulation problem? Well, who says the world has an overpopulation problem? I don't buy that. So it depends on whether you think that human brains are the kind of resource that figures out how to do more with less. And that is what I think. I mean, there's been a huge argument for years between the economists and the biologists. You know, the biologists often are pessimistic and they basically adopt a Malthusian perspective, and that is that we'll continue to breed until we exhaust the planet and do in all of our resources. And the economists always counter that by saying, hey, don't be forgetting that we can constantly figure out how to do more with less and that we're pretty damn smart. And I'm afraid I'm on the side of the economists. But even more to the point, you know, the projections right now indicate that we'll probably peak somewhere around 9 or 10 billion, sometimes by the middle of the 21st century, and then our population will start to decline pretty precipitously. And I think there's every reason to assume, especially at our current rate of technological progression, and our increasing willingness to take broader responsibility for the large-scale health of the planet, that we'll be able to manage that without too much problem. We can certainly grow enough food to do it if we put a little bit of effort into that. I'm not worried that we're going to overpopulate the planet and destroy everything. And I think that that's thinking that basically hasn't advanced since the 1960s, because we are making tremendous progress in pulling people out of the lower echelons of poverty. And there's a lot of terrible resource misuse at the lower echelons of the poverty distribution. So, for example, when people have to cook with wood, you know, that produces a tremendous amount of deforestation, for example, and that kind of thing. And I think we'll get our act together if we're fortunate. We'll peak around 9 billion. We'll be worrying about depopulation by the time some of the younger people are old. And besides, you have kids because that's part of life. So, and it's the two things aren't related in some sense as far as I'm concerned. So the trick is to have kids that are more good than harm. You know what I mean? Because people aren't only consumers, they're also producers. It's kind of appalling that we regard ourselves as consumers. So, you know, if you're going to have kids, have good kids. Make them smart, make them tough. Help them be tough. You don't really make them. Help them be tough. Help them be smart. Help them be responsible. And then, you know, maybe they'll do good. And that'll be good for the world and people. And like, I'm pro people, man. And so I'm not worried about that. So you know, I heard a university professor once who I also thought was completely reprehensible, who was like lecturing to a group of 18-year-old kids about how he and his wife had only decided to have one child because, you know, they didn't want to overpopulate the world. And I thought that if he'd only managed to reproduce one genetic copy of him, that was probably for the best. But then he told the whole room full of 18-year-olds that they should really think seriously about whether they have kids, and if they have any, they should just have one. And I thought, you son of a bitch, you know, you're so dedicated to the destruction of humanity and so rife with hatred for the human race that you dare to stand in front of kids who are just beginning their lives and say, well, you're a member of such a reprehensible species that the last thing you should do is multiply. It's like, no, sorry, I don't see any wisdom in that at all. And I don't think the world does have an overpopulation problem, and I don't think that there's any evidence that it does. Now, that doesn't mean that we're managing everything that we should manage properly. Like, we're really wreaking havoc on the oceans. But Boyan Slat, who's definitely worth looking up, Boyan, I think it's Boyan and Slaat, Dutch kid, has figured out, he thinks, how to get rid of half the plastic in the oceans in the next 5 years. So you could go support him. That'd be a hell of a thing to do. He's a real genius. And there's lots of ways that the burden that we're placing on our planetary resources is going to be lifted. And the trick is to get out there and do something about it. But it's hard to sort it out because so much of the climate change argument is predicated on an underlying philosophy such that if you're anti-capitalist, you believe that we're going to burn up the planet. And that's just not helpful, because I can't tell if your science is right or if you're just anti-Western and anti-capitalist. So, and like, I spent 3 years working on a UN committee that Secretary the Secretary General's high-level panel on economic sustainability, I think it was called, and it produced a report in 2013. And I spent about 3 years reading everything I could get my hands on economic development and environmental sustainability. And the state of the planet is far less dismal than the doomsayers would have you believe. I do think that the one thing that we're doing is, like, we're fishing out the oceans, like, idiotically. It's really, really awful. And trawling is a very damaging process. And I think that, like, if we left the damn oceans alone for about 15 years, they'd recover. Not the huge fish like tuna, because they take a long time to develop, but oceans would come back really quickly. And, but I think we'll get smart enough to do that sort of thing over the next 50 years because, human beings aren't stupid, and we've actually only been worried about the planet, let's say, since about 1960. It was only 100 years ago that it was more or less self-evident that the natural world was inexhaustible in comparison to the puny efforts of humanity. And, we only figured out that there was enough of us to cause trouble by about 1960. For Christ's sake, how long do you expect it to take us to figure out how to take care of a whole planet? We're doing a pretty good job for people who only stumbled onto the idea that there might be a problem something like 60 years ago. So I think we'll get it right, especially if more and more people start to act responsibly and truthfully and all of that, and start working for the betterment of things instead of trying to, undermine and hurt and engage in identity politics and all that sort of reprehensible activity.